All right. So one of the fundamental concepts in ecology is this idea of the ecological niche. And so, it's also one of those things that's hard to define. So I say this quite a bit in the course. I have said this quite a bit in the course so far, that we have these terms, but they're not totally well understood. Like when we were talking about natural selection, things that aren't totally well understood. So ecologists talk a lot about niches, but they don't always mean the exact same thing when they're doing that. So I'm going to try to cover a bunch of different aspects of what that might look like. Starting with, Eugene Odum, he has been called the father of ecology. And so this is a quote that he has to describe an ecological niche. The habitat is the animal's address, and the niche is its occupation. So that's kind of an interesting view. So here's two more sort of definitions that have been applied, or views that have been applied to this idea of a niche. So the first is the role of a species in the environment. It's kind of a vague definition, right? But what it's doing, what this definition is doing, is referring to the requirements of a species and how it affects and interacts with the environment, right? So it's the role of the species in that environment, how it interacts with that environment, how it affects that environment. And then sort of a more stricter definition that's kind of a part of that one is the requirements of a species in the environment. So this refers to what are the resources that the species needs, what abiotic factors it can tolerate or prefers, what interactions with other species that it has, other interactions with other species that it requires or can tolerate. And so another aspect is we can't really study every single requirement. Like we can never study the entire set of requirements, the whole niche. That's really hard to do. There's so many factors, but we can examine like specific requirements. So it might be easier to study a few of the requirements than the entire role of that species in the environment. So it's a bit more, you can bite off more chewable bits if you're just looking at the requirements. And so this idea, this view of a niche was formalized by G.E. Hutchinson. So he's the ecologist that sort of formalized this idea. And so we call this now the Hutchinsonian. So you can see it sometimes called the Hutchinsonian niche. And it's also been called a multi-dimensional hypervolume of all the requirements of a species in its environment. So of course, I just said we can't figure out absolutely everything of all the requirements of a species, but we can take some pieces and try to figure out what matters to the species. So it's called multidimensional because it can have multiple axes, and I'll come back to that, but that's where the word multidimensional is coming from, right? Because there's several requirements we can consider at one time. So multidimensional. And then it's called a hypervolume because when you get all those dimensions together, it makes a more than a two-dimensional space. It makes like a three-dimensional space, which is a volume. I mean, it can go even further than that if you have many, many axes, niche axes that you're assessing. Okay. So to sort of step our way through this definition of this multidimensional hypervolume. So imagine first plotting the survival and reproduction of a species. So the response variable we're talking about when we make these niche axes is fitness, survival and reproduction. These colored parts in the axes are reflecting where the animal is most fit, right? Where it's happiest, where it's surviving and reproducing. So we plot then the fitness, the survival and reproduction of the species versus a range of values of each resource that it requires. So the abiotic factors that it has to tolerate, and then the biological interactions, like the competition it has with other species. And so each of these factors then is considered an axis or a niche axis, right? So a niche axis. So in this example here, it's a one-dimensional niche axis because there's only one axis here. And that resource we're talking about is food size. And so what this line, this blue part represents is where the animal is most fit. So the animal's not very fit when it's eating tiny bits of food, and it's not very fit when it's eating large food sizes. So this range of food sizes is what confers the highest fitness to that species, right? So it's called multidimensional because then we can add more axes, but starting simply with this one-dimensional axis that has to do with food size. Okay, now we're going to add a second axis. We're going to add this y-axis that has to do with foraging height, the height at which the animal forages. And so now we add this additional dimension. So now we have a two-dimensional niche described for this species, right? So we know that this is the food size and this is the foraging height. So it gives us this rectangle shape where fitness is highest. Okay, and then we can even add a third one. So now we get really to that multidimensional hypervolume. And now we're adding an abiotic factor of the environment. And so then you add this third dimension of humidity. So now we have this three-dimensional rectangle that shows that hypervolume of where fitness is highest with respect to food size, foraging height, and humidity of the environment. Okay, so the organism can survive and reproduce only within some, certain range of humidities. So we graph that on this third axis, and then again enclose all of those points, and we arrive at this three-dimensional niche, or this volume, this hypervolume, right? Again, remembering that the response variable we're talking about, what the blue highlighter is showing, is this is where the animal survives and reproduces. Okay, so again, this one-dimensional niche here, that's just about food size. The animal could live on food of intermediate size, but not on food that's small or large. We add this second dimension, which is foraging height. So we have this two-dimensional niche, and then we add this third dimension, which is an abiotic factor of the environment. And now we have this multidimensional hypervolume. Okay, and so again, we call it multidimensional because we can add all these different axes, these different niche axes. Okay, but there's also two levels of niche that we can describe: the fundamental niche and the realized niche. So the fundamental niche, this refers to the range of tolerances and resources within which the species could theoretically occur, right? So this is what it could possibly do. And then realized is what it actually does, right? So the range of tolerances and resources in which the species could theoretically occur versus the realized niche, which is the range of conditions in which the species actually does occur. Okay, so you can think about this. We've talked about natality before. We talked about physiological versus realized natality when we talked about the lat clutch in birds. So birds can produce all kinds of eggs. That's their physiological reproductive output, physiological natality, but they don't actually produce that many. Instead, they have a realized natality of how many eggs they actually do produce. And that's, if you remember, the lat clutch, that optimal clutch size, which is dictated by how many babies they can actually take care of and fledge. Okay, so similar idea. There's what's possible, but and then there's what actually happens. So if we consider it from this diagram here, so this orange yellow part is the fundamental niche, and then here we see the realized niche, because there's these other circles around the outside, and these other circles could be representing, for example, competition. These could be the competitors' niches that are abutting against the species of interest niche, and so that pushes that the species of interest niche to be a bit smaller, right? They can't take up their entire possible niche because of competition with these other species that are around the outside of their niche. There's another way we can look at it. We can look at realized niche within the fundamental niche, for example, on these two niche axes. Okay, so we have two dimensions here. We have two abiotic factors of the environment. We have temperature on the x-axis and moisture on the y-axis. And the fundamental niche is this two-dimensional space. And then within that, we have this green circle, which is the realized niche. So the range of conditions in this realized niche is typically narrower than what's in the fundamental niche, right? And that's because there's many sets of abiotic conditions, like I said, which are listed here, but biotic factors might be pushing the species to be using its realized niche instead, which is similar to the previous figure that showed the niches of those competitors, for example, pushing in on the fundamental niche. So this, there's this possibility based on these abiotic factors, but the biotic factors kick in and make the species have to use its realized niche. And again, these biotic factors are like competitors, could also be predators, could be parasites. So these biotic factors tend to shrink the species down into its realized niche from its fundamental niche. Okay, so here's an example. So this example shows two species of barnacles that grow on different parts of rocks in the intertidal zone, right? So here's the ocean, here's the high tide mark. So we have this rock face, and we have these two species of barnacles that live here. We have this darker colored Thamatus, and then we have this lighter colored Balanus species. Okay, so When the lighter colored one, this Balanus guy, was removed in the experiment, it was removed from the rocks. And then the darker colored one, this Thematus, was able to then move down into the unoccupied space. So these guys, when these light colored guys were removed, the dark colored guys sort of redistributed themselves and started taking up that lower space. They moved down into the unoccupied area. And so basically, the dark colored one expanded its niche in the absence of the light colored one because the competition was gone. So then this dark colored one could use its full niche. So you can see that represented here. So the dark line is the fundamental niche of the dark colored barnacle, but here's its realized niche, right? So when this guy's present, it only can occupy this much of the rock. But when that guy's removed, it can occupy the whole thing. So obviously competition is restricting the dark colored guy to his realized niche, okay? And then if you do the other opposite of the experiment, when the dark colored guy was removed, so when this Thaumatus guy was removed, Balanus, the light colored one, did not redistribute and use and put its barnacles up here into the emptied surface. So it stayed right where it was. So what that tells you is that for the Balanus, the light colored guy, his fundamental niche and his realized niche are the same thing. So it didn't change its distribution. And that has to do with an abiotic factor because this high area on the rock is exposed to dry conditions much more frequently, right? It's close to that high tide line. And it turns out that this guy, this Balanus, can't handle that much air exposure. It doesn't do well. So it's already where it is in its realized and fundamental niche, which is driven by the abiotic factors, the exposure to air, right? Whereas this guy, the dark colored guy, he's being kept up to this part of the rock because of competition with this light colored guy. So he's only occupying his realized niche when his fundamental niche is actually much greater, right? So then from that aspect, which of these two species is actually the better competitor and why do you say that? Does anybody want to try answering?
It was the the lighter colored one.
Why?
Because the darker color one is able to inhabit the same territory as the lighter color one, but it isn't while it's present, which means it's outcompeting, the light one's outcompeting the dark one.
Yeah, exactly, Darwin. The light one is already occupying its full fundamental niche. It's already in charge, so to speak, right? So it's already the one. Thank you. Yep, exactly right. So that's an interesting little experiment that was done to show this difference between fundamental and realized niches and the role of biotic factors, the competition, and how that's manifested for these two species. Okay. All right. So now let's consider why ecologists worry about or think about ecological niches and how they're applied. So there's two ways. One is for species conservation. I'll talk about this. And the other one is for understanding interspecific competition, which you just saw when we talked about those two barnacle species. So the first is this importance in species conservation. So historically, it's been really difficult or almost impossible to measure the niche for animals in the wild, but recent developments in GIS, Geographic Information System mapping, ArcGIS and ArcInfo and those softwares, and also the fact that you can go to Canadian Tire now and buy your own handheld GPS unit. Your phone does GPS coordinates. So now this is much more readily available technology. So now we can get estimates of niches and resources for animals much more easily than we used to be able to do. So we can get an estimate of the realized niche by mapping the ranges of species very accurately and then overlaying the map layers, right? So it's showing it here, the forest type, the roads, hiking trails. That's, not the best example, but think about one of these forest type and the next one might be soil types and the next one might be humidity gradients or temperature gradients. So you can see how you could layer all those maps with a GIS system and then figure out where the animal is. So we can measure many niche axes together with these powerful GIS tools. So this kind of information is really important for species conservation, applying it to that context. So I'm going to tell you about a project that one of my graduate students did where he applied GIS mapping to try to figure out the critical habitats and the niches of Blanding's turtles. And this is important from a conservation standpoint because Blanding's turtles on a global scale are considered an endangered species. So I'm going to tell you about Chris Edge's master's work. He finished from the lab some time ago, but this is a good example of how this has been applied, how ecological niche has been applied. So Chris used GIS to identify the critical habitats and resources for this federally threatened species, or federally endangered species. And as I said, it's a globally endangered species as well. So he looked at multi-scale habitat selection and investigated the critical habitat and resources for Blanding's turtles. Okay, so just to tell you a little bit about what critical habitat is. So this is a term actually that comes from our Federal Species at Risk Act. So Species at Risk Act, and the acronym is SARA. So the critical habitats are those habitats that a species needs to persist. And so for under the definition, under the legislation, this is typically most often talking about nesting sites. So here's a Blanding's turtle nesting here. And then the other one that's usually really important is overwintering sites, because the populations can't persist without nesting sites for eggs to be laid, and without overwintering sites, especially in northern climates where animals spend about half their lives, right? Turtles spend about half their lives in hibernation sites. So those are obviously critical habitats. Okay. So looking at habitat selection. So we talked about this a little bit in the lab. So there's habitat use versus habitat selection. So the habitat use is just observing where the animal is on the landscape, what kind of habitat it's in. Habitat selection is a sort of step above that, in that you look at the disproportionate use of habitats compared to what habitats are available, right? So it's a more powerful way to look at it, because now you're seeing what the animals are choosing based on what's available to them. So it gives you a better idea of what's really important to those animals. And the other thing about habitat selection is that it can occur at multiple spatial scales, right? You can have what's happening at a fine resolution point, at a bigger resolution, and at an even greater resolution on a spatial scale, right? So this habitat selection, it occurs at multiple spatial scales. And so to conserve critical habitat for species at risk, we need to understand at what spatial scale animals are selecting habitats, because that's going to help us define, what the niches are and how we can protect those, right? So we need to know at what level. And so I'm going to walk you through a couple of levels here. So the first is the location. So here's a map of a study site, and here's a red dot that indicates an individual location chosen by a Blanding's turtle. The inset down here is just showing you the overall geographic distribution of Blanding's turtles. Okay? You can see they're restricted in their distribution to just sort of along the Great Lakes here. Okay, so the first spatial scale is at the location level. And then the next spatial scale is at the home range level. So these are all the radiolocation points, for example, for an individual turtle connected with, you guys have learned about, a minimum convex polygon, right? So we have that as the home range of an individual. But then there's also the population range. And the population range is a minimum convex polygon that's drawn around all the radiolocation points for all the turtles in the population that you're studying. And so there's, in this simple example, 3 different turtles are indicated here. There's the turtle who's indicated by the green radiolocation points, the turtle indicated by the yellow radiolocation points, and the individual turtle indicated by the red radiolocation points. Okay, so that then is the population range. So we can look at habitat selection at these different scales. Okay, just a little bit more about the Blanding's turtle, like why it's an important species to look at for this, because it is an endangered species at the federal level. So COSEWIC is the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. So this is the body of experts that does the status assessments. And so the Blanding's turtle is considered endangered in Canada. And as I said, it's also considered endangered on a global scale. It's a largely aquatic species. So it uses several wetlands in a single year, but it will travel terrestrially to get among those wetlands. So it sort of wetland hops and uses from 2 to 4 wetlands in a season. It tends to occur at low population densities. There are some higher density populations, but for the most part, they're sort of widely distributed across the landscape. So it's harder in some cases to get information about them. And they have a crazy life history. They're extremely long-lived. They probably live for well over 100 years. And so it's hard to learn about them when they live for that long. We can take snapshots of their lives and try to understand what they need from those. And the other thing that's important is that I showed you that range map of the species. About 20% of the global range sits in Ontario and Quebec, which means that Ontario and Quebec have a fairly large responsibility for making sure that this species persists on a global scale. Okay, so here's Chris as a young man from some years ago. Chris now has a PhD and a postdoc and is working as a research scientist for the federal government out east. Okay, so the location of the study was in Algonquin Park, and there's some pictures here of Algonquin Park. He used radiotelemetry, so here's one of his turtles and his receiver and his antenna there. So he used radiotelemetry, and he used spatial analyses. So he used GIS, he used ArcGIS to do his habitat selection analyses. And the habitat types were demarcated with a handheld GPS, and on maps, but then he also went out on foot and made sure that what the mapping was saying was what was really happening on the landscape. So a lot of work to do this. Okay. And so I mentioned that there's these different spatial scales. So the first spatial scale, the biggest one here, is this population range. So every one of these red diamonds is a turtle location. So all the turtle radio locations here. And then there's this minimum convex polygon that encloses all of those radiolocation points for all the turtles in the population. So this gives you that population range, okay, of all the turtles in the study. And then within that, of course, is the home range. So each one of these red polygons is the home range of an individual turtle sitting within that larger context of the population range. So again, it's a minimum convex polygon is what he used to do this analysis. And then, of course, within each of these home ranges is the individual locations that are used to draw that home range. So those are those three spatial scales. Okay. And so Chris did his habitat selection analyses at two scales. So the first was the home range within the population range, and then he did the location within the home range. So those are the two scales he looked at. So habitats, what he found is that selection of habitat within the home range was non-random. That means it was biologically meaningful, right? So habitats within the home range were different than what was generally available in the population range. So they're choosing their home ranges specifically and not just using what's available. The home range habitats are actually different than what is generally available at the population range. So there's selection happening. That's what this non-random aspect means, right? So home ranges were selected, habitat selection was occurring at that spatial scale. And he categorized his habitat. And you guys don't need to memorize like what habitats Blanding's turtles use. That's not what's important here. What's important is just the process of being able to do this assessment. So he then, based on some additional analyses, he could rank which habitats were most selected, like which were the most important. And so ponds and sphagnum marshes were really important for the turtles, and then creek deltas. And then the third sort of most important of those things were the creek itself, terrestrial habitats, and a sedge meadow. Again, I'm not worried about you guys memorizing exactly what Blanding's turtles need. That's not what the point is. This is just showing you an application of how we can use GIS and niches. So we're gonna keep moving towards that. And this is the cover. This is a Blanding's turtle. This is a picture taken by Chris actually, and it was the front cover of the journal in which the paper was published. So that was very exciting to have Chris's picture on the front cover of the journal. Okay, and so then the next spatial scale was this location, individual locations within the home range. And again, it was found that this selection was non-random. So habitats at the individual turtle locations were different than what was generally available in their home ranges too. So habitat selection was also happening at this spatial scale, which is pretty important. So this finer spatial scale was also specific selection was happening. And again, pond and sphagnum marshes were important sites, and then the creek. So this switched a little bit, and then the creek delta and terrestrial. But then what Chris did was try to stitch together the findings of those two spatial scales of habitat selection to come up with sort of an overall, what is most important to these turtles. So putting the two spatial scales together, we get this overall ranking of habitat preferences for Blanding's turtles living in Algonquin Park. So ponds and sphagnum marshes. So ponds and sphagnum marshes, these are the most important habitats for that species. So we can define those habitats. Creeks and creek deltas were the second most important, and then the sedge meadows and terrestrial sites were the least important. They were still used, but they were the least important habitats. Okay. And so then Chris took it to another step. he then tried to identify the specific habitat features that the turtles were selecting. So we showed that the location was specifically selected from what was available in the home range. So what is it about those locations that's so important? And this is where Chris really tried to dive into this niche analysis type of aspect. So next, Chris tried to identify the specific habitat features that the turtles were selecting within the broader habitat categories that I just showed you in that ranking. So what are the turtles choosing at that specific location scale? And so these specific features represent the requirements, right, of the Blandings turtle in their environment. So this is representing the niches. So the biotic and the abiotic features that are represented. So there's three things that Chris tried to assess. So one was the resources. So this was the prey food available. So he did some benthic and vertebrate analysis, right? So that's one niche axis. And then temperature, right? So a biotic factor, and here's an abiotic factor, an abiotic requirement. So he looked at temperature because it's important for thermoregulation, right? So that's an important, obviously, abiotic factor. And then another important biotic factor had to do with vegetation structuring. So with the layering of vegetation and the vegetation species present. And then within that habitat structure component was also water depth. So that would be another abiotic factor that could be important. So Chris tested which of these niche axes are the most important for Blandings turtles, right? So which niche axis is the most important? So you can kind of imagine it. I drew that. I showed you that three-dimensional hypervolume. So I tried to draw also I can't show it. Maybe you can kind of see that of a three-dimensional hypervolume of what it might look like here, what Chris is doing. So on the y-axis, we have the vegetation structure. On the x-axis, we have the resources, those benthic and vertebrates. And then on the z-axis, right, that diagonal one, that's water temperature, for example. And then there's some theoretical hypervolume in there that's going to be the niche of those turtles. Okay, so that's what he was trying to do. And what did he find? Well, he compared these features at turtle locations, and he paired it with random plots. So he was trying to look at selection again at that scale. So he looked at these variables at where the turtle was, but then he also paired it with a random site and measured the same variables, because then he can look at what they're using versus what's randomly available, right? And he did this over different seasons that matter to the turtles. So there's a pre-nesting season, a nesting season, right? Because females might be choosing very particular things during nesting season, and then summer, and then pre-hibernation. So he divided it up by seasonal activity patterns. And he found that in summer, water depth and the amount of vegetation, emergent vegetation, were the most important distinguishing features to separate a turtle location from from those random locations. So in the summer, these are the niche axes that were most important: the vegetation and the water depth. Okay, so that biotic factor and that abiotic factor were the two most important niche axes. So he found that, for example, I thought this was interesting, that this availability of food didn't distinguish between turtle locations and random sites. And this suggests that food is not a limiting resource for these guys, that there's tons of food around. And that's kind of an interesting thing, because oftentimes we think about food as being a very limiting resource. I could get into all kinds of discussions and hypotheses about why that might be. One being that turtles are bed hedgers, and bed hedgers do not exist at carrying capacity. And so there's not going to be competition for those resources. So there's all kinds of ways you can speculate why that might be happening. But basically, Chris's study identified critical habitats and also the niche axes that are important for species conservation, right? So we know that we need to pay attention to emergent vegetation and water depths, in addition to those general habitat categories for this species. So it's kind of a neat application of this niche theory to a real world conservation scenario. Okay, so the second part was to understand interspecific competition. This is why it might be important to understand ecological niches. So niche theory has also been frequently applied to this understanding of interspecific competition, this competition between species, right? Because competition, if you remember from the barnacle example, competition is what causes animals to use their realized niche instead of their fundamental niche, right? So competition is an important piece of this story. So in particular, we can consider a community of many different species, each with its own niche, where the species with more similar niches, of course, they're going to be more likely to compete with each other, right? If they need the same resources, then they're going to definitely be competing. So then we'd predict that we're not going to see two species in the community that have exactly the same niche because they're competing, right? We're not going to see them. So if two species had the same niche, they would be in such strong competition that whichever of the two species was a little bit better at competing would cause the other one to go extinct. So that's, remember, competitive exclusion. We talked about this extensively last time when we talked about the Logico-Volterra model, right? So when you have two species competing for the same niche, you're going to end up having, if it's exactly the same niche, you're going to have competitive exclusion. One species is going to win out over the other, right? We talked about that explicitly last time. But then think about how different species with similar niches, so not exactly the same, but with similar niches, could occur together or coexist, which was another example we did with the Logico-Volterra. So one possible way for this coexistence is through what's called niche partitioning. They carve off little pieces of the niche, so that they can both persist. So the example we did last time had to do with the birds and the seed size. Remember, we had that example that in the habitat where both seed sizes occurred, the two species could coexist because one species ate the little bit smaller seeds and the other species could eat the little bit bigger seeds, and therefore they could coexist with minimal competition, right? But in the case where there was only small seeds, then the species that favored small seeds competitively excluded the other species, right? So if you remember that, so that Logico-Volterra stuff can be viewed in the context of this niche, ecological niches. Okay. So what happens when two or more species are using, use a portion of the same resource? So how could this look? And so we can see niches that are overlapping, and this is going to depend on competition, right? So what happens when two or more species use a portion of the same resource? You might see niches that are overlapping or not, and it's going to depend on that level of competition, right? So these niche relationships can be visualized in these sort of graphs like this. So we can have this resource gradient graph, or we can have these Venn diagrams. These are a couple of ways to look at these niche relationships. Okay, and so if we can kind of go through these. So each letter is a different species. This is species A, species B, C, D, etc. So species A and B, they have this overlapping parts of their niche, and it's about equal breadth for both species that's overlapped, but then they're competitive at opposite ends, right? They're competitive exclusion over here and competitive exclusion over here, right? B and C also have overlapping niches, but unequal amounts. So C is sharing a bunch more of its niche with B than B is sharing with C, right? So there's some overlap there, but of unequal breadth. In the case of C and D, they occupy adjacent niches along this resource gradient, but they're abutting against each other. So there might be a little bit of competition, right, happening. Little possibility of competition because they're sort of abutting each other, but they are quite close. But you contrast that with D and E, who are quite far apart on the resource gradient. So they're probably never going to compete, right? Because they need very different things on that resource gradient. So they're unlikely to compete, no competition. And then if you look here at F and E, you see that F's niche is sitting right inside of E's niche, right? So F has a niche that's contained within the niche of E. So F is competitively superior to E, right? It can persist within E's niche as well. So this shows that F is the better competitor in this particular example. All right, so here's another way to look at niche overlap. So this is among 3 related bird species along 2 different niche axes. So we've got habitat type on this one dimension, and then we've got territory size across this other dimension. So this shows niche overlap and habitat partitioning among 3 species of grassland sparrows, and it's in a Pennsylvania study site. And so habitat is this first biotic factor, and then territory is the second biotic factor. So it's a 2-dimensional plot of those 2 discriminant axes. And so there's a couple of things to note that, you see this overlap between the grasshopper and the savanna sparrow here, quite a bit of overlap on this habitat type axis. and you can then compare Henslow's sparrow to the savanna sparrow, there's actually no overlap, right? They're quite separated in the habitat types that they use. So there's not competition happening between them because they're far separated across that habitat type resource gradient that's there. Okay. So, we could plot the range of resources like food size used by an animal along the length of the axis. And then we have these curves on it, like I showed previously, right? That represents the niche width, okay? So we have a resource gradient here. Again, it could be, food size that used. It could be food type, like whatever it is, or habitat, whatever the resource is that we're talking about. So theoretically, the niche width, then this width of what they use, this is going to be what is the realized niche, what the animal is actually using. So the niche widths are usually described as being either narrow or broad. So for species B here, it has this narrow niche width, and species A has this wide niche width, right? Across this resource gradient, A can use lots of things across there, whereas B is more restricted in what it's using there. So this is a hypothetical distribution of species A, which has a broad niche, and species B, which has a narrow niche across this resource gradient. There is some overlap across between the two species, right? So B is sharing more of the resource with A than A is sharing with B because a larger proportion of B's niche is within this overlapped part. Okay. All right. So we're going to come back to this idea of this distribution across this resource gradient in a little bit. I want to talk first, though, a little bit more about the resources themselves that could be the things that are across these gradients. So we'll consider the resources by animals and how, what might be limiting or not. So when we consider the resources, we should also consider whether or not they can be a limiting factor. And that is, would they be a factor in short supply for some species? And then maybe that's going to limit the size of the population, the size that the population could grow to. So, okay, just some basic resources. And this is not rocket science. This is pretty straightforward stuff, right? So, of course, food. And typically we do think of food as being a limiting resource, as I said earlier. So it was interesting in the case of Chris's Blanding's turtle study that at least the benthic invertebrates that they eat did not seem to be a limiting resource. But as I said before, I could sort of explain that away in the context of them being bed hedging species and not existing at their carrying capacities. Water, it could be a limiting resource, especially if you're talking about dry environments, right? Like desert environments, savanna environments. Places to reproduce, like to mate or produce offspring, or build your nest, right? So these can, of course, be limiting resources in the environment. Cover or shelter from predators, of course, that could also be limiting resources. And then oxygen, that's an abiotic factor that's important, right? And we could think about that. Usually we would think of it as not being a limiting resource, but there's sometimes when it could become a limiting resource. Like if you think about animals that are semi-aquatic animals, semi-terrestrial animals, but then they hibernate in wetlands in the winter. And once the ice cover and snow cover comes on that wetland, then there's oxygen can become limiting because it's just what's available as dissolved oxygen in the aquatic system, right? So for some animals that hibernate aquatically, oxygen might actually become a depleted resource or a limiting resource during that overwintering period. Okay. So back to that graph that showed A and B and this wide and narrow niches. So species differ in the way they use those resources. So specialists, those are the guys that have that narrow niche, right? They have very specific forms of some resources that they require. So for example, many species of insect herbivores are specialists on just one kind of plant host. So the classic example, of course, is the monarch butterfly. The caterpillars can only eat milkweed. The adults can take nectar from several different species, but the caterpillar relies on milkweed for its food source. So those resources then are considered essential. There's no other plant or form of food that can substitute, right? Those are essential. They have to have that one. So in contrast, then you have generalists. These are the guys with a broad niche, and they can use a variety of different forms of some resource. And so that means that resources are substitutable. If one's not present, then they can just switch to another, right? So again, specialists versus generalists. And as you might have expected, niche specialists tend to be the species that are at greater risk of extinction because their resources are not substitutable. Those essential resources, they can only use one thing. So here's a few examples of species that are critically endangered or in serious trouble, and they have pretty specific requirements. The keynote checker spot butterfly that lives in Southern California has a very strict requirement to live in semi-arid shrublands, and it is an endangered species. The silky sifafka in the rainforest of Madagascar, it's a critically endangered species. There's lots of reasons for that status, of course, but one of them is this dependence upon rainforests, which are being removed. There are other reasons as well. And one that's more near and dear to my heart are these hellbenders, which are one of my favorite amphibians. Hellbenders are aquatic salamanders, but they breathe through their skin for the most part. And their habitat is quite narrow, the resource in terms of their habitat. They use fast-flowing mountain streams, and they're common and not common. These streams exist in the Appalachian Mountains of the U.S. They are considered endangered in 6 of the states in that area. And so the key thing for them is this really fast-flowing, not very deep rivers that come from the mountains. Because these salamanders breathe through their skin, and you can see the maximized surface area that this guy has here, they have to have very clear, fast-flowing water. And because of human changes to the landscape, of course, there's a lot of siltation in these rivers, and so the salamanders can't survive. They can't live. Super amazing salamanders. They're like, over a foot long, and they're just really fun to catch. I had a friend who did his master's degree on hellbenders in West Virginia. So I got to spend a lot of time in the West Virginia rivers looking for these salamanders at night. Super cool. Okay, so then we can do another comparison of 2 turtle species looking at this specialist versus generalist sort of aspect. So a little bit more closer to home example. So here's the painted turtle on the left. At the provincial level, this species has not been assessed for endangerment, but it's perceived as pretty common, right? Here's a group of basking painted turtles at one of our study sites in Algonquin Park, and a nesting female at our study site in Algonquin Park, and cute, super cute little babies. So I think probably all of you in the class have seen a bunch of basking painted turtles on a log somewhere. So we perceive these as being pretty common, and we perceive them as being fairly generalist in their habitats. Right? They live in lots of different kinds of wetlands. And they even like man-made wetlands, right? And so we consider these to be fairly generalists and not to be at great risk. At the federal level, actually, painted turtles are listed as a species of special concern. But generally speaking, we perceive these guys to be sort of fairly common. And then there's the wood turtle. The wood turtle is listed as an endangered species in Ontario, and it is very much a habitat specialist. So it's sort of akin to the hellbender. Wood turtles need fast-flowing, clear trout streams, or just fast-flowing cold water sort of streams. And because they spend the winter in those creeks and rivers, those fast-flowing streams, and then they use the adjacent woodland habitat, terrestrial habitat, to feed in the summertime. But they have this very strict requirement of these fast-flowing rivers. And of course, in most of Ontario, those fast-flowing rivers have been rechanneled and silted and filled in, and agriculture goes right up to the shores of them. And so that means these animals can't persist. They require highly oxygenated habitats versus, again, painted turtles can handle low oxygen water. They can handle higher oxygen water. They can handle lots of different abiotic factors. These guys cannot. They need high oxygen, fast-flowing cold water. And so if you then would plot those guys across that resource gradient, if you consider this resource gradient to be habitat type, for example, wetland type, you can consider that painted turtle to be more of a generalist, right? It can use lots of different types of wetlands, versus the wood turtle, which you can view as more the specialist. It only can use these fast-flowing creeks and rivers that have either a cobble or a sand bottom. It's very particular. The types of habitats that they use, which of course makes them at greater risk of extinction. Okay, so species also differ in the way they use those resources. So different foods have different qualities, right? So it depends on depending on what the animals are eating, they need to spend different amounts of time foraging. So, for example, herbivores, they feed on leafy plant material, and that material is low in protein. We've talked about this before, right? It's low in protein, hard to break down. They have those symbionts in their guts to help with that. So they need to take in a lot, and so they need to spend a lot of time foraging. Predators, on the other hand, right? They feed on animal material that's already a lot like them in terms of its constituents. So they spend more time stalking and catching prey and not so much time constantly eating. So again, the animal material that they eat is higher in protein and already very similar to themselves in terms of digestion. So this ties back to the idea of optimal foraging theory that we talked about in the lab and a little bit in the lecture as well, right? There's that aspect. Different foods have different qualities. And then there's also physiological differences among species that affect how they use their resources, right? And also it's going to affect what resources they require. So for example, if you think about endothermic species, those species that generate their own heat, for species that have large body size, they don't require as much energy per gram of body mass to thermoregulate because they have a lower surface area to volume ratio, right? They don't lose heat as much. So think back to the metabolism lecture that we talked about, tying lots of stuff together in today's lecture. So go back to that metabolism idea. So smaller endotherms, on the other hand, right? They have much higher energy requirements per gram of their body mass because they have rapid heat loss, because they have a high surface area to volume ratio. So this even takes us back to the ecological rules lecture as well. So both the metabolism and the ecological rule lectures sort of come back together when we think about these different ways that species use resources, right? So the little guy has a much higher surface area to volume ratio, right? So there's gonna be lots of different aspects to its energy and thermal regulation. Okay. All right, so to summarize what we talked about today, I'm hoping I have time to show a little video. I think I will, since, looks like we'll have time. So niches and resources, right? So niches are the requirements of a species in the environment, sometimes defined as the role of the species in its environment. Talked about fundamental versus realized niches, right? So fundamental is what's possible, but realized is what the animal uses. And usually that's dictated by biotic factors like competition or parasites or something like that. But the fundamental niche is typically dictated by those abiotic factors, and then the realized niche is what happens when the biotic factors kick in. That's often how it plays out. We talked about the application of the ecological niche to a couple of different things. First, to species conservation, and we did the case study looking at critical habitat and resource selection, resource requirements by Blanding's turtles. And then we looked at how we can apply niches in the context of interspecific competition. And we tied that back to the Lotka-Volterra lecture that shows competitive exclusion, right? When you have two species that need the exact same niche, one is going to competitively exclude the other. But if you have some niche overlap and you can have some niche partitioning, then you can maybe have coexistence, right? If you have niche partitioning, you could have coexistence of the species. And then niche overlap is when there's actually some overlap between the species. They share some part of their niche as well. Okay, and then niche width we talked about was specialists versus generalists. So specialists have resources that are not substitutable, so they tend to be more at risk of endangerment in that conservation context, versus generalists who use resources that can be substituted, and so they tend to be a little bit less susceptible to threats for decline. Okay. All right. First, I will go to. Look at all these comments. Oh my goodness. Let's see. If there's any questions here. Are there ever any instances in nature where resources are so abundant that the two species with the same niche can coexist? Maybe humans and animals. Interesting point. Okay, so an instance in nature. I'm sorry, I'm just reading the chat. Are there ever any instances in nature where resources are so abundant that two species with the same niche can coexist? I don't see why not. And so Darwin makes that interesting example of humans and animals that feed on crops. But that's such an artificial sort of situation too, right? Anyway, so Samantha, that's a really good question. And I imagine that could be a possibility, assuming that resource is not limited. I don't see why it couldn't happen. I did think about it a little bit more. If I come up with a different answer, I'll let you know. Okay, so I'm going to go back to share screen. So I have those crash course in ecology videos. We've seen a couple of those in the lab. I love those videos. So I have one that I want to show you that's about community ecology. It's 11 minutes long, so we definitely have time to watch it. And I love the way that the speaker presents information. So this one, as I said, it's about community ecology. And it covers a few things that we've been talking about lately. So I thought we would watch it together. Now, I have never successfully showed a video with share screen, so I'm going to try it and hope that it works. So optimize screen for sharing video clip. So I'm going to click that. And
I wouldn't be much of a teacher if I didn't tell you that life is tough and that everyone's looking out for themselves in this world. That's just the way it is, people. You know, I always say that biology is ultimately about sex and not dying. Well, both of those things are more difficult than we'd like them to be because of competition. There's a finite amount of resources on the planet, so evolution drives us to compete for them so that we can survive long enough to spread our genes all over the place. And naturally, competition is a really important part of how different species interact when their habitats overlap. These interactions between species are what define ecological communities. So it makes sense that community ecology studies these interactions anywhere they take place, from a tide pool to the whole ocean, from a rotting log to an entire forest. But just because interspecies interaction is mostly competitive doesn't necessarily mean that community ecology is all about big bloody tooth and claw scenes like from cable TV nature shows. Actually, a lot of it is, but we're not going to get there until next week. For now, let's just note that competition, while prevalent and important, is also pretty dangerous, kind of a hassle, and can really hurt. So a lot of interspecies interaction is actually about sidestepping direct competition and instead finding ways to divvy up resources or otherwise let species just get along. Can you feel the love?
can you guys see it?
Careful, guys, because right now we are surrounded by potentially lethal interspecific competition going on all over the place. Since we're animals, we usually think of competition as going on between animals, but really it happens between almost all members of the four kingdoms of life. Whenever species compete, they're going after the same resources that they need for their survival. Continued population growth. In this garden, the weeds are competing with the sunflower and the corn and the dill for the nutrients and water in the soil. So these resources, because they're finite in this area, are the limiting factors that we've talked about. The population can only get as big as these factors will allow. Now, a particularly nasty weed could, over time, eliminate the veggies entirely. Such elimination is known as competitive exclusion, and it's one of the most fundamental properties in community ecology and also, life. Because the fact is, when two species are competing for the same resources, one of them is eventually going to be more successful and eliminate the other. This bitter truth is known as the competitive exclusion principle, and it was first identified in 1934 by Russian ecologist G.F. Gauss in a study of two closely related species of microscopic protists. When he was only 22 years old, Gauss made a name for himself by conducting experiments that pitted one species of protist, Paramecium aurelia, against another, Paramecium caudatum. First, Gauss grew each species separately with the exact same resources and found that each developed rapidly and established stable populations. But when he grew them in the same container, P. caudatum was soon driven to extinction by P. aurelia. Paramecium aurelia gained a competitive advantage because its population grew slightly faster than P. caudatum's. So Gauss's experiment showed that, in the absence of another disturbance, two species that require the same resources cannot live indefinitely in the same habitat. The inferior competitor will be eliminated. Makes sense? But if competitive exclusion is the natural law of the land, then why isn't all of Earth just a crazy crap circus of constant competition, predation, and ultimately extinction of all of those losers? Well, for a couple of reasons. First, not all resources are limiting. Two species of sharks may compete for water in the ocean, but the ocean is, gigantic, so that's not what limits their population growth. Rather, the amount of food, like a specific fish that they both eat, could be limiting, while other resources are plentiful. Second, as the overwhelming diversity of life in almost any community shows us, most species, even ones that are almost identical to each other, are adaptable enough to find a way to survive in the face of competition. They do this by finding an ecological niche, the sum of all resources, both biotic and abiotic, that a species uses in its environment. You could think of an organism's niche as its job in the community that provides it with a certain lifestyle. We tend to keep jobs that we can do better than anyone else in our community, and if we're desperate, we do a job that nobody else wants to do. But no matter what job we have, what it pays in terms of resources dictates our lifestyle. So finding a nice comfy niche that you have pretty much to yourself not only provides a steady income of food and other stuff, it also allows the species to avoid competitive exclusion. And this, in turn, helps create a more stable ecological community. It's an elegant and peaceful solution. I wish that we humans could figure out something as good, but as with anything in life, this relative security and stability comes at a price. The bummer is that it prevents some species from living the lifestyle that they could have if nobody else competed with them at all. This ideal situation is called a fundamental niche, and it's just that, an ideal. Few, if any, species ever get to live that way. Instead, because of the need to avoid competitive exclusion in order to survive, many species end up with a different job, and hence lifestyle. It's not necessarily the job that they studied for in college, but it makes a decent living, and that's called a realized niche. This, my friends, is how nature does conflict management, but it sounds kind of unnatural, doesn't it? I mean, Gauss taught us that competition and winning the competition was the natural order of things. So how could it be that part of the natural order actually involves letting everyone compete and win just a little bit? And how did we ever come to discover that things actually work this way? Well, it took a special kind of person, and to tell you about him, I'm gonna need a special kind of chair. Canadian-born ecologist Robert MacArthur was in his late 20s when he made a discovery that made him one of the most influential ecologists of the 20th century. While researching his doctoral thesis at Yale University in 1958, he was studying 5 species of warblers that live in coniferous forests in the northeastern United States. At the time, because there were so many different species of warblers that lived, fed, and mated in such close quarters, many ornithologists thought that the birds occupied the exact same niche and thus were an exception to Gauss's competitive exclusion principle. But MacArthur was not convinced. A mathematician by training, he set out to measure exactly how and where each kind of warbler did its foraging, nesting, and mating. In order to do this, he studied each tree the birds lived in, dividing them into zones, 16 zones to be exact, from bare lichen at the base of the trunk to new needles and buds at the tips of the branches. After many seasons of observing many birds in many trees, he found that each species of warbler divided its time differently among the various parts of the tree. One warbler, called the Cape May, for example, spent most of its time toward the outside of the tree at the top. Meanwhile, the bay-breasted fed mostly around the middle interior. MacArthur also found that each of the warblers had different hunting and foraging habits, and even bred at slightly different times of the year, so that their highest food requirements didn't overlap. These differences illustrated how the warblers partitioned their limiting resources, each finding its realized niche that allowed it to escape the fate of competitive exclusion. The phenomenon he observed is now known as resource partitioning, when similar species settle into separate niches that let them coexist. Thanks in part to this discovery, MacArthur became known as a pioneer of modern ecology, encouraging curiosity and hypothesis-driven research, championing the use of genetics and ecological study, and collaborating with biologists like E.O. Wilson and Jared Diamond. Sadly, he died of renal cancer at the age of 42, but his study of northern warblers remains a classic example of community ecology that is still taught today. So if organisms can do this, if they can behave in ways that help minimize competition while increasing their odds for survival, it follows that traits associated with this behavior would start being selected favorably. After all, that's what natural selection is for. When this happens, it's known as character displacement. To demonstrate, let's go back to some other famous ecologists, our favorite couple of evolutionary biologists and lovebirds, Peter and Rosemary Grant. I told you before about how they observed the process of speciation among Darwin's famous Galapagos finches. Well, on the same island, Daphne Major, in 2006, they witnessed character displacement in action. For a long time, a small population of finches had the island to themselves, where they ate a variety of seeds, including seeds of the fever plant, which were bigger and more nutritious than the smaller seeds that were available, but were harder for the little finches to open. Then, in 1982, a group of much bigger finches showed up on the island, and they began to commandeer the island's abundant supply of fever plant seeds. Within just 20 years, the Grants found that these small finches' beaks shrunk to allow them to specialize in eating only these smaller, less nutritious seeds. But now the little finches had those seeds all to themselves. The traits of the two populations had actually diverged to help facilitate the partitioning sharing of resources. See, competition can be hard on us, but it can also make us better people, or, finches, warblers, or kangaroo mice. But there are also kinds of interspecies interaction where species actually join forces in the fight for survival. This is the ultimate in conflict avoidance. In these cases, species in a community actually manage to avoid competition altogether by forming downright tight relationships that benefit one, if not both, of the parties involved. You may have heard of both of these cases. First, mutualism, where both species benefit, and commensalism, where one species benefits and the other's kind of like, whatever. Mutualism abounds in nature, and for those who've been paying attention to Crash Course, you've heard me talk about it many, many times before. A prime example are mycorrhiza, the fungal roots that we talked about a few weeks ago, where fungi and plant roots get entangled and essentially rub each other's backs for nutritious favors. Others you may have heard about include flowering plants that produce nectars to attract pollinators and that bear fruit to attract animals to help spread the seeds inside. Oftentimes these relationships become rather needy, like in the case of termites. They can't break down the cellulose in the wood they eat without the enzymes produced by the microorganisms that live inside their digestive systems. Without the little critters, the bigger critters would die. Such a needy relationship is called obligate mutualism. By contrast, commensalism is where one species definitely benefits and the other isn't really hurt or helped. Such neutrality, of course, is difficult to prove because even a seemingly benign interaction probably has some effect. Barnacles, for example, hitchhike on gray whales, getting a free ride through swaths of plankton-rich water for feeding. While clearly a benefit to the barnacles, the relationship is often considered commensal because the whales probably don't really care whether the barnacles are there or not. Or do they? The barnacles might slow down the whale as it swims through the water, but on the other hand, they might also serve as a type of camouflage from predators like orcas, in which case they confer an advantage. So it probably comes down to meh for the whale, and when you consider all the other possibilities out there when species interact, meh isn't such a bad option, especially considering that next week we're going for the throat, by which I mean we'll be investigating the kill-or-be-killed world of animal predation and all of the fantastic evolutionary changes it can trigger that lead to even greater diversity in ecological communities. There probably is going to be a lot of blood though, so you might want to bring your poncho. Thank you for watching this episode of Crash Course Ecology. If you want to review anything, there's a table of contents over here for you to click on any of the parts that you may want to review. Much love and appreciation to all the people who helped us put this episode together. And if you have any questions or comments or ideas, you can leave them for us on Facebook or Twitter, or of course, down in the comments below.
Did that work? I hope. Oh, yeah. This guy's professional reason I passed my first year. Yeah. Yeah. Want to bring a poncho. I know. Yeah. So, okay, good. I'm glad it worked because when I'm sharing the video, I can't see any of the Zoom features. At least I haven't figured out how to do that yet. Oops. Apparently the commercial is still going. Hold on. There we go. Yeah, obviously I'm still working on that. Anyway, okay, cool. Yes, those crash course videos, I find them super useful. Super, super useful. Does anybody, we still have a bit of time. Does anybody have any questions or other stuff they want to bring up? You do have your last lab on Monday. And it'll be, so you have some things you need to do for that lab, right? You need to bring your literature cited, some papers that you found that are going to support your final manuscript. You need to come with your hypothesis and predictions about what you expect to see for the kill rates and the different habitat types so that you're ready to have a discussion. And the TAs are also going to talk over with you the feedback and stuff so far on the writing assignments that you've had. And make sure you look back at the first lab presentation about scientific writing. Make sure you look back at the feedback you've received so far as you're preparing that final manuscript. Basically, that final manuscript is the equivalent of your final lab exam, putting together all the things that you've learned about so far. Okay, and if everybody's good, you're free to go.
Did you just want 3 lines on the graph?
Yeah, so there'll be, the graph will have, so this, your sort of first stab at doing your graph, you should bring it with you on Monday as well, Cheyenne. And yes, it has 3 lines on a single set of axes, and each line is the mean of the data.
Okay, thanks.
For that treatment, yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Jackie. Have a nice day.
Yeah, you guys too.
Thank you.
I have a quick question. I just noticed the the final exam has been posted. And it's set for the 14th or 12th, one of the two. And that's
hold on, let me check when it is Saturday, December 12th at 9 a.m.
Perfect. Saturday, December 12th. Right. Awesome. Okay.
I haven't made the exam yet, so I don't know any details about it yet. But
perfect. No worries. I just wanted to confirm the date. Thank you.
You're welcome, Kiana.